The the shiur, or the discussion probably is on the study of Geonica, and Geonica is a term created by the first academics who started looking into Geonic studies, um, and some observations on the general that I've come to have from studying Geonim and beginning to work on my Shulchan Aruch project. So a few points that have to be made firstly about Geonim. Geonim are not a monolith. There is a very wide diversity. You have to know which yeshiva which one came from, which yeshiva at which time were considered stronger and powerful, which Geonim were political appointees, and which one were actually appointed on the basis of their very clear knowledge and things like this. So firstly, to speak about some of the political aspects. In the early period of the Geonim, so we had under the political rule of the time, I believe it's the Sassanids, I may be mistaken, but they appointed the Resh Galuta, the head of the exile. So one of the most famous ones, in fact, the real story behind him is already incredible as it is, but then you add in all the legends about him and it becomes even more a spectacular story. It was a guy called Bustanai. Bustanai was made the Resh Galuta, and he gave an inordinately huge amount of power. In fact, he was allowed to have, he was given almost total rule over Jews. He was second to the king, essentially, and he gave a lot of that, they had a lot of legal power. Now, so that was probably the zenith of their authority and control in Bavel. He had two wives, and one of them was born Jewish, and the other one was a Persian convert. And she was the Geonim themselves, a maid that she was perfectly shomer, she was, God-fearing and so on, as were her children. Now, this was the start of a major political problem, is that his descendants all vied for the power of Resh Galuta. And at different times in history, the Resh Galuta was either appointed or at least confirmed by the Geonate, or it was just appointed by the king. So it was one or the other. And the Geonim, as a rule, sided with the claims of, not always, but generally sided with the claims of the kids who were from the converted one. So that put them in a very difficult position. So, of course, born Jews were less happy about that, so it eroded some of the power of the Geonim. So we find Teshuvot now and then where they stress the Jewishness of the people. We also find, for example, the advent of the Karaites, Anan, was his father's name? Anan ben Yosef or something? Anan, the Ananites. So he was supposed to be, he was a genius, there's no question about it, and he was definitely had a lot of skills, and the Geonim at that time had the power to choose who would be the Resh Galuta, and they chose his younger brother. And so he rebelled, and he appointed himself the Resh Galuta, so the king considered that as a form of rebellion, because of course. So he was arrested and he was going to be killed, and he essentially said that, no, I'm of a different religion, and therefore it's not the same thing, and eventually then he created his own, the beginnings of Karaism. So the beginnings of Karaism, it wasn't exactly, it wasn't about textualism, because textualism, although that was a lot of it, it was about his own oral law, and that, of course, eroded the position of the Geonim as the authority over Jews, and also the Resh Galuta, the proper Resh Galuta. On the other hand, it also strengthened them in the sense that all these people became separate. Now, then we start finding the polemics against these people. So at different stages in Teshuvot, you can see the different conditions. You can tell when the Geonim were in power. You can tell when they were battling. It's very, very common in the Teshuvot of Rav Natronai Gaon, that is both the first and the second. There's two Rav Natronai Gaonim, and they were both. It's very, very difficult to separate the Teshuvot from them, which we'll get to in a moment. We don't know which one comes from which, but one was much earlier than the other one. The second one is the more famous one and the more well-known one. So we have a lot of political situations happening, and all this had a heavy effect.
Rach.
Sure. Yeah.
So I've heard mainstream Ashkenazim argue that the Geonim don't have as much of a pull or a say because very little's written about them. So or very little's written by them that we have. Is that because they're Ashkenazim and don't have access to the stuff that we have access to, or I was confused by that statement, so I figured because Rambam refers to the Geonim a lot, like what would be the issue?
Well, yes. Well, it's like this. It's quite simple. It's not a specifically an Ashkenazi thing to say that we don't have a lot from Geonim. It
Okay.
is in general. It's a very very common conception or misconception. It depends on how you see it. Um, if we compare the period of time of the Geonim, it's a long period. It's about 500 years. Compare the period of time of the Geonim to the times of the Rishonim, right? Then for sure we have a lot less. But on the other hand, we have plenty. It's just that the question is, how do you read it? Otzar Geonim. By the way, most of that good academia on Geonim is not by Sephardim. I'll tell you, the good academia tends to be Ashkenazi academics who are very good academics who are not biased in any specific way. You just simply want to state what it is. So you have Levin, you have, although he was an academic, Rav Leiter, which I'll get to, it's fantastic. Of course, you have Sephardim as well, but when we're talking about academia as opposed to rabbinics, you'll find that most of it is Ashkenazim. So it's not something that cuts cleanly Ashkenazi Sephardi lines. It's the question of, in rabbinics it does, for sure, in rabbinics,
Yeah.
but not in academia. So
Sure.
it's very difficult to make these lines. Now we do have plenty from Geonim. The problem is like this. So I believe like Rav Levin, who wrote Otzar Geonim, which is a collection of teshuvot from everywhere. I'm not convinced that he did a particularly good job in working out which are valid teshuvot, which are not. But he did do a great work, and he does great cross-referencing, and it's a really really important resource. But he correctly divides on his Otzar Geonim, which is according to the tractates of Talmud. He correctly divides them into two types of teshuvah: a teshuvah which is explaining Talmud, and a teshuvah which is a halachic teshuvah. Now, the teshuvah that interested me more, although both you have to study both, especially for my Geonica project, Shulchan Kalanim, which we'll get to. The teshuvah which interested me more are the halachic ones. Now, halachic ones may not necessarily be halacha. For example, from Natanai on, we find a lot which are political, like against certain minhagim and so on. They're not necessarily halachic, but it's sort of to keep the Jewish people together. But it's like a pesach. It is comparable to a pesach, even though it isn't. And I don't think even he thought it was binding. He was simply giving advice. And if he had authority, then essentially he was setting the community practice. We find a lot of diversity. A lot of communities were doing their own thing in Geonim. We find that Geonim had to fight with certain communities. One of my proofs against Minhag Mevatel Din is that we have a teshuvah from Rav Semach Gaon, I think, or Rav Yehudai Gaon. So teshuvah from it's very famous. I believe it was Aleppo, Halab, where they were doing a lot of things against halacha, and he kept on sending them letters to someone to stop, and they kept on sending him back Minhag Mevatel Din. They're quoting the Gemara, misquoting Minhag Mevatel Din. And so the proof is, if he kept on sending them letters, he obviously didn't agree. And we also don't find in the Geonim really ever, we don't find their statement what they did. But back to the point. So halachic teshuvot, and this is one of the most important observations you can make. Halachic teshuvot are usually exceedingly short. Not always, but generally they're short, and which means that they require a lot of you have to unpack them. So sometimes, for example, you have a statement, it's simply a quote from the Gemara. You have to know it's a quote from the Gemara, or you have to look it up and search it, or it's a quote from a previous Gaon, or whatever it is. So you have to unpack the statement. So when you look at the Gemara, you then work out what their reasoning was. I'll give you an example. There is a teshuvah in a Teshuvot Min HaGeniza. Okay, Louis Ginsburg was the first to publish in book form Teshuvot of Geonim that came from the Cairo Geniza. Now, he makes a lot of mistakes reading manuscripts now. Because I have access to the manuscripts, it means that automatically I have to look at a whole bunch of other academics or whoever else go with the same things, and because very often they correct his readings of these manuscripts, which of course aren't easy to read. But there is a fragment of Teshuvah. It's near the beginning of the book 2. Book 1 is where he explains Geonim. A lot of things he says are a bit strange. Some of it's correct, and it's not. But in the second part, where he actually publishes the Teshuvot, the fragments, that's a very useful part. So there's a fragment of the Teshuvot by Rav Tzemach ben Paltoy Gaon, and he writes about Yain Mebushal. It's a Teshuvah about Yain Mebushal. There's quite a few of them actually, and in this fragment, for example, he states that for the four cups on Pesach, that a person should use wine, and if he doesn't have wine, he should use yain semukim, raisin wine. Now, this raises an obvious question. The Gemara says explicitly any wine that is kasher b'diavad for the mizbeach is kasher lechatchila for kiddush. So why should he say that you can only use it if you don't have regular wine? Because we know that b'diavad yain semukim is kasher for the mizbeach. So what's the problem, right? It should be mutar lechatchila. So at first I thought, and it's for sure a misunderstanding, that maybe he considers it better to use yain which is kasher lechatchila for the mizbeach. But then there's no source for that, and it's a big chidush. It doesn't really make sense. And so I realized that he's referring to a whole different halacha, is that to use the yain hamufchar, you should use the best wine that you have. He's referring to that, but it's not clear in the text. You have to work it out. You have to unpack it until you get it, and especially that text is unclear because only a part of it. It's a partial part of the Teshuvah, the second half. Okay, next point is Rav Yisrael Moshe Chazan. Okay, so when I started my Geonica project, so I started first and foremost with Teshuvot HaGeonim, Sha'arei Teshuvah. Sha'arei Teshuvah is one of many collections of Teshuvot HaGeonim. They all come under different names. Sha'arei Tzedek, Teshuvot HaGeonim, there's one name which is just plain Teshuvot HaGeonim, there's a few types like that. Teshuvot Min HaMizrach, Min HaMa'arav, there's a whole bunch. So Sha'arei Teshuvah, so he wrote a lot of Teshuvot or explanations to these Teshuvot, but most of them are unpublished. We only have published until Sha'arei Teshuvah Siman Kuf Sadik Gimel. And his style is very interesting. He goes into great depth analyzing the Teshuvah. He points out when a Teshuvah is not necessarily from Geonim. Mixed into Teshuvot Geonim, specifically Sha'arei Teshuvah, you find Teshuvot from Rif, you find Teshuvot from Ramban, you find a mix. So you have to always cross-reference and search and check where is it from. A lot of Teshuvot, by the way, we get from second-hand sources. It's quoted by some other person, and therefore then it's copied and put into a collection of Teshuvot by whoever put together these Teshuvot. So you have to also know that.
Who put together Sha'arei Teshuvah?
Most people who we actually don't know who made most collections of Teshuvot. It just means someone took a whole bunch of Teshuvot and put them together, right? You collect them and put them together. Which is why it's been noted about Sha'arei Teshuvah. One of the academics on Teshuvot HaGeonim, I forget his name, I have it somewhere on my computer. It's a very good academic work. And he points out about Sha'arei Teshuvah is that most of the Teshuvot are reliable, more or less, and that he says that also when it says who the author is, it's also more or less reliable. The only time sometimes it says va'od and further he said, like one Teshuvah after another, that's not necessarily reliable because the person who collected and put together may not have put them in the right order, and therefore you can't always tell who the author is. Rav Yisrael Chazan goes to great lengths to try and figure out who the author of certain Teshuvot are. Besides for Rav Yisrael Moshe Chazan and his fantastic footnotes, so because he never finished, or he did finish, but it's never been published on Sha'arei Teshuvah. So there's a second person of great importance, Ashkenazi, and his father was his son also wrote a very good book, and his name is Harav Zev Wolf Leiter, and he was the abbot in Petersburg, Mechon Rambam Petersburg. He had a Mechon called Mechon Rambam in Petersburg, and he was, I think, the first of the religious, I would consider him one of the first of the good religious academics in a sense. So he wrote footnotes to Sha'arei Teshuvah. Unlike Rav Yisrael Moshe Chazan, he's very, very short. It's usually cross-references to a lot of works, but it's incredible work. The cross-references are very, very good. for all different types of things. And he very rarely, every now and then, he makes some footnotes. So he knew what he was doing very often, because you see that he quotes Sefer HaTanya, which is not, of course, the Baal Tanya. Tanya Rabbati is it's viewed by most people to be a summary of Shibboleh Heleket, which is extremely important for understanding Geonica. Shibboleh Heleket was a sefer written in the Middle Ages in Italy, and it collects teshuvot and writings from everywhere, from Geonim, from North Africa, from Germany and France. A lot, we have a lot in there. Shibboleh Heleket is extremely useful. It's very important. And so he was aware of this, and so he does a very good work. Now, an example of the problem of studying Geonim is that eventually you realize that there's a lot of forgeries. And in one of my articles, which I've got here, one of my articles, I actually made this point. In this article, Halacha and Custom of Halacha and Misconceptions of Parsha, an article lecture by Rabbi Chaim Noah. And there he quotes a teshuvah. Quote a teshuvah of the Geonim, Brohaya Gaon, in a sefer called Timim De'im. Yeah, which is a book by the Ravad, the second Ravad, the Ravad of Posquieres, Balas Sodot. Here, so I pointed out. So, and this is just an example of the problem. Firstly, it is very shoddy scholarship to rely on a teshuvah quoted in someone's name. So, the next one, without verifying the authenticity of said teshuvah in other sources. When you have a teshuvah quoted in one source, you should always look for it somewhere else. I actually looked for this particular teshuvah, and I didn't find it. Secondly, it is disingenuous in the extreme to not state that this teshuvah, this is a teshuvah quoted by the Ravad, and not a direct source. To him, the aim is a book by Ravad, not a collection of Geonica response. In other words, did he see the teshuvah? Sure, he probably saw it. You know, I don't think that he was necessarily lying, but that doesn't make it a valid teshuvah. You know, a lot of, and I'll get to this in a second, so a lot of people have copied the teshuvot, so they may have added their own footnotes to it, their own notes to it, and eventually these things got added in to the actual text. We have this very often in manuscripts. They thought it was a correction or something that they added in, or someone actually forged it. Not everyone is trustworthy. Yeah, so then I point out to anyone even slightly familiar with Geonica literature, it is common to find forgery in authentic teshuvot, especially from Reb Chaim Gaon, especially because Reb Chaim Gaon holds a very specifically high position as the last of the Geonim, and one who set down everything. He went and he knew what the previous Geonim said, so he sets down the case. Over here, I actually quote what I wanted to speak about right now. I'll give you an example. Okay, so another example is also, it's not necessarily the case, but it's very commonly the case that when you find a teshuvah which is quoted as Rav Hai Gaon with one yud, it's much more common that that's going to be an incorrect teshuvah or something. When it's Hayeh with two yods, it's more common that it's correct because that's the correct spelling of the name. These amounts are outside. So I'll give you this example. So I mentioned Rav Leiter, and this is why I'm such a fan of him, because that he could pick this up. And this is a teshuvah in Sha'arei Teshuvah Kuf Sadik Vav, and it's not actually quoted by, and there's no Yehayam on it that we have printed. So so I'll read the teshuvah, and then I'll read Rav Leiter. I noted in my Shulchan Kavonim that this teshuvah can't be true on the basis that it contradicts another teshuvah of Rabbeinu Hai Gaon. So this teshuvah is attributed to Rabbeinu Hai Gaon. It contradicts another teshuvah of Rabbeinu Hai Gaon, but he doesn't bring that point. He brings a different point, which we'll get to in a moment. So Simon Kuf Tzadik Vav says like V'shesha'altem, and that which you asked, in the matter of washing hands. דתנו רבנן, כל המצוות כולן מבורך עליהן עובר על עשייתן, חוץ מן התפילה, חוץ מן התפילה, that which the rabbis taught in the Mishnah, that all the mitzvot, all of them, we bless before we do them, except from tevilah. It's actually tevilat ger, tevilat eved. A ger, a convert or a slave, cannot bless before going to the mikveh because they're not yet Jewish, so they can only bless afterwards. So, and those are the two exceptions, and that's explicitly in Torah. Misha hayu yadav metunafot or meluchlachot, because lechot yadav lechot ematan v'rech. Someone whose hands were dirty and he wants to wash them in order to eat. So where does he bless? Al netilat yadayim. Yeah, where does he bless the bracha al netilat yadayim? Kodem sheyirachatz kachol mitzvot, before he washes, like all the mitzvot, or la'achar sheyirachatz, or after he washes. Ki ra'inu miktzat chachamim midamnim ota l'tfilah, because we find some chachamim who compare it to going to a mikveh, the tevilah. Ve'omrim, and they say, afilu dehave gavra dechazi v'tahor, כיוון שיהיה לו מטונפות או מלוכלכות, מוטב לו שירחץ ידיו ויהא בנקיות ויברך ממה שהיה בלכלוכו. מצד החכמים אומרים, לא תהא אלא מקודם ככל המצוות שהברכה עובד עשתה. So he brings two opinions. Opinion that says no, you have to clean it first, and that one says no, like every ברכה you bless before. כך אנו רואים כי עיקר הרחיצה היא בשעה שמנגב ידיו. This is what we see, the main washing is when he dries his hands on the towel, because that cleans it more. דהתנינן דכתיב ככה יאכלו בני ישראל את לחמם טמא שאסור למשמש בפת וידיו אינן נגובות. Because the halacha says you're not allowed to eat the bread without your hands being dried. Of course, I'm not translating directly, I'm summarizing. Okay. Karalon Tameh, it's called Tameh when your hands are wet when you eat bread. Even though you wash them, and then not dry, not towel. Alma Benigiva Talia. Therefore, we see that it relies on drying with a towel. Bechazinan Ben Rachitzal and Giva. We see between washing and to dry with the hands, that's when he blesses. And it's like he's doing it after it's like doing it before he does the mitzvah. Because if you're not allowed to eat with your hands are still wet, so then you haven't done the mitzvah yet until you dry. So then therefore it must be the main mitzvah of the netilat yadayim is when your hands are dry. Right? Yeah. טעמנה, צריך לברך השקל שלנו במסותיו וצביונה, להכניסו וכו', אף על פי שנתעכב ולא בירך, אלא קודם קריאה, שפיר דמי. Okay, the same thing with milah. The common practice nowadays is you bless ala milah, you then cut the orla, then before you do the periah, which is the next part of the milah, so that you best lachniso rito, even though he hasn't finished, and then he does the periah, because but the problem with comparing to this example is, anyways, the Gemara says, someone who does the milah, he does the cuts of the orla and the priya, it's as if he didn't do the brit at all. So it's a little bit incomparable in this case, because even though you may be required to dry your hands, it does not necessarily mean that you haven't done the tilah. It's just because you've been to eat bread with wet hands doesn't mean that you haven't done the tilah. But anyway, moving on. The afal pi shenitakev, sorry, velo birech el kodem priya shapir dami the tanina mal velo para ki'ilu lo mal. Right? Exactly like I said. Alma priya talia hachinami. So just because it's on the priya, so here too. Kol zaman sheyadav b'chot en hanikiyot shalem v'lefichach mevarech kodem hanigiva. Yeah, and therefore he blesses before he dries with the towel. The yesh min harishonim, and there are those from the first ones. Amru shekol lecheluk v'tinuf ein ma'akev et tefillah, af netilat yadayim ein ma'akev u'mevarech im netilat yadayim. Okay, so then there's this from the first one that said that all the dirt and disgusting of hands does not b'diavad, it doesn't hold back tefillah. So like if you didn't bless before tefillah, if you didn't do netilat yadayim, it's b'diavad okay, even though Rambam explicitly says that you have to. In fact, Shulchan Aruch as well also says that you have to wash. Everyone agrees you have to wash before Tefillah. In his Ma'akiv, the question is whether you say a beracha. It's a machloket with the Rashba and Rambam. So whenever there's a machloket with berachot, Shulchan Aruch always considers that to be a suffix berachot. Says not to make a beracha, but he absolutely does say that you have to wash your hands before Tefillah. Anywho. עד נטילת ידיים אינו מעכב ומברך עם נטילת ידיים. נטילת ידיים זה not מעכב to make נטילת ידיים. So Rabbi Leiter gives a very very short footnote. He says עין שאלות ותשובות הגאונים ליק. One of the תשובות הגאונים was by a guy called Lick. It's a very very good collection by the way. סימן צדיק ג' בעוצר הגאונים פסחים פסחים, sorry, עין ו' שכאן נזדייף התשובה השאלה וגם בסיומה. Here it's being forged, the answer to the question and also the end. וכן במאמרו של רב שלמה אלבק מחוקקי יהודה באשכול אלבק וכי מלשון עיקר רחיצה עד ויש הראשונים אינו מלשון הגאונים. Is that because it doesn't have the language of the Geonica. There we go. The guy in Petersburg realized it doesn't have the language of Geonica. So this is the point, is that you know when something does or doesn't have a language. Now, essentially, this seems to be a ziyuf to back up the opinion of what people were doing in France, and then the fact that they were washing first and then blessing. So there's a lot of reasons why this is correct. You have to bless before washing. I point out that, for example, there's a halacha. It's stated that someone who washes his hands for fruit is like a gasei ruach. He's a show off. He's up himself. But once again, you're making a beracha on the fruit. Don't you have to? How can you make a beracha if your hands are dirty, right? So the whole point over here is, who said that because your hands are dirty you can't make a beracha? Only when halakha says you can't make a beracha with dirty hands, that's when it's a problem. You can't make a beracha with dirty hands for tefillah. You can't make a beracha hamotzi lachem min haaretz with dirty hands. That's why you do netilat yadayim. But the beracha netilat yadayim, why do your hands have to be clean? It's an obvious question, right? Do we have to wash our hands before every single beracha we make? No, we don't. So why does the hands have to be clean for netilat yadayim? Right? And the fact that they say the neguf is the main part of the netilat yadayim, that's not at all. Because you say al netilat yadayim. And it just occurred to me that the whole proof that they try to bring from Milah, from the practice, by the way, it's machlokas when you say the beracha lachnis or b'rito shel Avraham, to be, without getting into that argument, the fact that the first beracha you say, the mola, the beracha on the Milah is done before you even cut the orla. That is the beracha on the mitzvah. Lachnis or b'rito shel Avraham, it's not on the mitzvah. It's on the mitzvah. You did do the beracha before doing the Milah. Now, the reason why this contradicts is this is Teshuvah of Rabbeinu Hayeh Gaon. If I remember correctly, it's Siman Zayin. And he explicitly states, and he doesn't state any exceptions to it, he restates the Gemara. He says, Kol berachot mevarech over l'asiyatan chutz mitzvot ger ve'eretz. You see, Siman Zayin. That's not Zayin. Okay, I don't remember what it is offhand. It's in a while. Yeah, but there's a clear teshuvah. It's in my I actually quoted it somewhere. Somewhere or another. Never mind. Whatever. Okay, so moving on. So things like that, for example, clear forgeries. So yeah, there are many ways to look at it. Either pre-academia or seeing things that just don't make sense. We don't find out the Geonim saying them, or are contradict the Geon who's quoted in the name. Things that don't fit the language of Geonim. So you find out. Now, Or, like I said before, I mentioned that Teshuvah stated in one place that can't be backed up from other places. So, for example, Sefer HaManhig sometimes quotes Teshuvah Geonim. In my booklet on the halachot of Chanukah, I quoted from the Manhig, and I have no idea whether it's found or not. I've only seen it quoted from the Manhig, by the Manhig. So you also have the Tur, very commonly quotes the Geonim. So in my Shulchan Geonim, for example, if I haven't verified the Teshuvah, so I noted for myself that in red, that I have to see if there's if it's actually written. So אפילו כהן גדול, כהן עם הארץ, קודם לישראל תלמיד חכם. Right, for to go up to a Torah, it's Tur b'shem Rav Nachman Gaon. Now I believe that's correct l'halacha, b'chol, so I concluded it because it's correct, but still, the fact that it's from Nachman Gaon, you have to find. So אחרי, here we have another case, אחרי שאלו כהן לוי ישראל, מותר לקרוא אחריהם כהן, ואין חששים שירמו על הכהן הראשון שהוא פגום. Okay, after you've done כהן לוי ישראל, unlike common practice nowadays, according to this, you can call up a Kohen again. So the Shai Teshuvah Siman Gimel says this, which is the shoot also for, I believe, Teshuvah of Rif, Reis Tzadik Daled. And I made a footnote on it. If I remember correctly, it's been a long time since I looked at this one. Yeah, so the Sha'arei Teshuvah of Yisrael Chazan considers it to be the same Teshuvah as Rav Amnon Gaon. So I don't know why it's in red. Because it looks to be exactly that same Teshuvah. The question is, how can it be there if it's in Rif? But it could be that it's actual source from Ravina Hayagon, so that's why I left it. I'll have to revise that a bit. It could be Ramagon, it could be Rif, it could be Hayagon. Sometimes it's just not clear, and so you do the best you can. Yeah. Alright. Moving on. I wanted to say, different types of works on Geonim. So, thank God I have a very good relationship with a very open-minded and great Talmid Chachamim here in Australia, Chabad rabbi, and he has a lot of Sefarim of Geonim. He's very open-minded, he has very wide interests. So he lent me a few good books. One of the good books he lent me is Mafteach LeTeshuvot HaGeonim. You can get it on Hebrew books, but he lent me a copy, and this print was actually a very special printing in 1959 in New York. And in fact, it was only printed, he made 159 copies. It actually says over here that this is the 156th copy, so it's very interesting. So this is a guy, a famous person relatively in the world of Geonica called Miller, Yoel HaKohen Miller. And this is it's not easy to use, but it's very good index of Teshuvot HaGeonim. So this is the type of thing I'll use quite often. Then we have other works. Okay, so this is the Shai Teshuvah, and Shai Teshuvah Shalem with Rav Leiter. And so they have a set called Toratan Shel Geonim, which I only found out about relatively recently, and I borrowed this from as well. So there's different volumes, and it goes according to Geonim. So this one is the writings of Sharir Gaon and Rabbeinu Hayer Gaon was his son. So it has over here their Sefarim. Some of them, they wrote Sefarim, right? Some. And so it has the Sefarim as well as it has Teshuvot. What else? Bahag. Bahag is a very important topic. The Ban Halachot Gedolot is one. The Halachot Gedolot is one of the Sefarim written. Originally, people thought that it was written by Rav Yehudai Gaon, but now we know that it was written by Shimon Kayara, who wanted to go on. In other words, he was the head of the Geonic Academy. And there are Teshuvot Geonim that, for example, they disagree with him, or there's one Teshuvah which says that someone came along and added his own thing and mixed it up. So the question is, were they against the author behind himself, all the additions to it and the changes to it, it's not very clear. But as you said, it's very, very clear to Shabbat so that some guy came along and messed things up. It's still very important because behind the notes what people did very often, and there's no reason to mistrust his statement of what people were doing. So to match that up to Geonim, and sometimes when he agrees with Geonim, so he quotes Geonim, so it's still a useful source, even though it's not reliable as to say this is the Geonim position or this is the halacha. Certain statements which we know are come out of nowhere, very strange, such as Arshut Taravim is 600,000 people, things like this. The Hag was heavily accepted by Rashi and Tosafot. I am convinced that they didn't know exactly the whole story of it. They probably considered it to be a regular Geonic work. Rav Yehudai Gaon, who was attributed, the Hag was attributed, Halachot Gedol was attributed to him. He actually did write a sefer called Halachot Pesukot. It's a very important sefer. So we're moving on from Teshuvot to now books actually written by Geonim. So you have Halachot Pesukot, Rav Yehudai Gaon, which I haven't had too much time to look at, so I can't comment on it much. But then we have one of my favorites is a She'il Tot of Rav Achai Gaon. She'il Tot is one of the first halachic works, and it actually goes according to the Parshiot of the Torah. And She'il Tot of Rav Achai Gaon is really, really very fantastic. Like many Gaonic works, it quotes the language of Talmud, and it takes the language of the Talmud and it puts it into according to topics. And for example, in one of my papers, I pointed out that the source for Chalitat Basar, is actually my latest paper, is that is using the Geonim, we can figure out the correct Girsaot in a Gemara, right? So there's a big argument over where did Rambam get the din of Chalitat Basar from, especially because oh, and by the way, I have to thank Rav Daniel Cohen, who actually is on Facebook. Not very active, but he pointed me out to some of the sources. But anyway, so we find that there's an argument over Rambam when he speaks about Chalitat. Where did he get it from? Where is it in the Talmud? It's not very clear. So the Ravad was Masig, and the Migdal Oz tried to defend Rambam. But basically, all these is not. This is a little bit of a waste of time because when we see the actual Gemara, we see that there. Where do we know the correct use of the Gemara? From Rav Achai Gaon, who quotes it. So in the Gemara, the Gishta of the what's it called, the Vilna. So it says like this: Amar Rava Moshe mi Amar Rachmana Achol Dama Chatche Umalche Afilu Lekdera Nami Shapir Dam. It's a statement which really doesn't make a lot of sense. As I point out, Baalei HaTosafot, they force themselves to try and explain this. See there, and indeed, it's impossible to understand. It's hard to understand what it says. Afilu lekadera, okay, even for a kedera, right? So don't complain, people, for not understanding Gemara. When we look in the She'il Tot, it says it slightly differently. Firstly, it removes Amar Le Rava Le is added in, it should say, and Moshe, and also doesn't have the word mi. Mi Amar Rachmana doesn't make sense. So Moshe Amar Rachmana, God said, Achal Duma, eat blood, Ella, but, yeah, which is what it says in the correct case, Chatche, cut it first, Umalche, and salt it, Ve'edache, and wash it, Ve'apil, not Ve'afilu, Ve'apil means to throw, to make it fall into the pot, and it's alright. Ve'apil kedera, that's part of the process of making it kasher. Right, so why does it say you can eat blood? Because once you've salted it and there's a little bit of blood left in the meat, so you put it into a boiling hot water, and the boiling hot water seals the skin, and then the blood doesn't come out. That is the correct Girsa, and this was also pointed out by the Nesiv in his Perush Emek She'ela, in his Perush on She'il Tot Rav Achai Gaon. So it's very important for that as well. What else do we find in Geonim that I want to speak about? I should take a note. Important Geonim. Some Geonim we have to be aware of people who are called Gaon. So because of the political situation and depending on who had the power to appoint the heads of the academies, not every Gaon was necessarily fit for the position. And also different yeshivot at different times had different stands, different strengths. So the most important focus of anyone who wants to know what the Gaonim really thought the Tanakh Hamim, you have to focus on the big names. It's just the way it is. So for example, some of the most important ones to focus on is Rav Tzemach Gaon, Paltoy Gaon, Rav Tzemach Ben Paltoy Gaon, Rav Natronai Gaon, both of them, Rav Amram Gaon, Rav Saadia Gaon, Rav Haya Gaon, and his father Rav Sharira Gaon, amongst certain others. Now, they all have different styles. They all do it very differently. So you have to understand there's no universality. You have to understand that you have to know who's speaking as much as you can in order to work out what they're saying. What else? Alright, so I wanted to speak about the final thing, just to finish off. The only thing I want to speak about. So my project, Shulchan Aruch, it's a huge, huge project. It will take me years. I don't really have time to do it, so I want to mention, here's the story. I don't have access to all the stuff that I need. I don't have access to those resources. I also don't have the time. I have received an offer that if I get another sponsor, so this person will sponsor me. By sponsorship, I mean like this. I have to buy materials, books, which I'm willing to give to the sponsors when I'm done with them. So you give money for a book, I use the book, and then I give it to whoever the sponsors, as well as sponsoring for time. I have to do it. I have to take on a job. I have university and other things. I simply cannot afford to make time unless unless it's worth it for me, time-wise. So I'll have to cut my job time. It's the only time I have. And so if anyone wants to aid me in this, both financially or research and things like that, I would greatly, greatly appreciate it. Or if you know anyone who could, please let them know. This project is essentially to get Piskei HaGeonim, the general final decisions, and put it according to the order of the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch can have a clear reference immediately to the view of the Geonim on the matter, with extensive footnotes, with my He'arot, Chidushim, whatever, notes where the Teshuvot come from, Rambam and so on, which reminds me, that's another point I wanted to make. Rambam sometimes uses the language of Geonim. I was very delighted to actually discover a few cases. He uses the language of Geonim in his halachot, as opposed to directly from Talmud. He uses the language of Geonim, so we find that somebody doesn't even state it's Geonim, and it's actually a copy of Geonim. One example is regarding Sudah Shelishit. I don't remember which Halacha is, but it's almost a word-for-word copy of the Teshuvah Geonim, which I saw in Otzar Geonim of Levin. But anyway, so back to my point is that it's a huge effort, and if anyone can help, it would be greatly, greatly appreciated. Again, most of the sponsorship is simply so I can get the books. Instead of it's very difficult on Hebrew books. So pages are missing sometimes. It's very hard to study off the screen. And yeah, so that would be greatly appreciated. Anyway, is there any questions on Geonim and Geonica Teshuvot? Oh, yes, it's another point that I wanted to make. Because we were discussing before about how the world sees Geonim. They think Geonim are very simplistic sometimes. They think Geonim are very short because the Teshuvot are short. They think they're not involved in learning. It's not true. They are very involved. You have to look in the exact language of Medayek when they have questions and they're answering on how to understand a Talmud. They tend to go in greater length. When they write a sefer, for example, how you go on Hilchot Tefillin, writes a sefer, so it's longer. There are examples where I found that Geonim clarify points in Rambam or Rif. For example, there's a apparent disagreement between Rif and Rambam on Tosefet Shabbat. It's implied from Rif, and the Ran also understands it this way, that there is Tosefet Shabbat, whereas from Rambam, it's only implied that it's Tosefet Inui for Yom Kippur. Tosefet Yom Kippur. There's a Teshuvah Geonim, it's not explicit, but it implies that it's only Yom Kippur as well. things like that. So you have to know the sugya, and then you understand what the chidush of the Geonim are. People assume from other teshuvot, later teshuvot, rishonim achronim, that look at teshuvot and they'll get it. That's not true. It's just not the case.
But they had literature in Arabic, right? I know.
Yes, it's a good question. Besides, so of course, we're going to go on his tafsir, which is the translation of into Arabic of the Tanakh, as well as his Emunot V'Deot. You sometimes find teshuvot written in Arabic. They're generally written in Aramaic or Hebrew. You sometimes find them in Arabic. So the ones in Arabic, I don't really touch personally because I don't have the requisite knowledge.
No, but
I'd rather do a better job on less than to do a slightly worse job with things that I have to rely on other people's translations and so on.
No, I know Ephraim Gabai was looking at the Arabic stuff from the Geonim. Or he's acquainted with that.
Oh, good. Very good. But we don't find a huge amount of teshuvot in Arabic. There's not a huge amount. And if there are, it's usually not halachic in nature. It's usually something political or whatever it is. So, yeah, Chirogany is exceedingly important. It helps us to verify teshuvot. We quoted all over the place, which we don't know whether they're valid or not. Things like that. Anything else? Any other questions? No?
No.
All right, no one? Your microphones are off, so if you want to ask something.
No, we're good. Thank you very much.
No worries. No worries. Hopefully, I hope to learn some, make a shiur to learn some teshuvot geonim be'iyun, and to give some more practice, some actual examples of this happening. And yeah, we'll see what happens. All right. Thank you all. Aslacha rabbah.
Thank you.
And hopefully see you next week. All right.
All right.
Good night.